Jack Morrison had spent 22 years avoiding attachments, but the dying animals surrounding the abandoned mine gave him no choice. 38 starving creatures had been deliberately left to die, and the cruelty of it made his hands shake with a rage he thought he had buried long ago. Before we continue, don't forget to subscribe to the channel, like the video, and comment where in the world you're watching from. Let's go. The dust from the trail still clung to Jack Morrison's weathered face as he guided his mare, Sadie, along the ridgeline that overlooked the forgotten stretches of the Arizona Territory. At 42 years old, Jack had spent more than half his life drifting from one cattle drive to another, from one temporary job to the next, never staying long enough in any place to call it home. The loneliness had become as familiar to him as the weight of his saddle or the creak of leather beneath him. It was a companion he had learned to live with, even if he had never quite made peace with it. The October sun hung low in the western sky, casting long shadows across the scrubland that stretched endlessly in all directions. Jack had been riding for 3 days since leaving the Johnson Ranch, where he had spent the summer breaking horses and mending fences. The work had been good, the pay fair, but when autumn arrived and the ranch hands began talking about their plans for winter, about the families waiting for them in town and the warm hearths they would return to, Jack had felt that old restlessness stirring in his chest. He had collected his wages, packed his bedroll, and ridden out before dawn without saying goodbye to anyone. It was easier that way, cleaner, without the awkward well-wishes or the pitying looks that always seemed to follow men like him. Men who rode alone. Sadie picked her way carefully down a rocky slope, her ears flicking forward as she navigated the treacherous ground. Jack trusted the mare completely. She had been his constant companion for 8 years now, and in many ways, she was the only relationship in his life that had lasted. He patted her neck affectionately, feeling the warmth of her coat beneath his calloused palm. At least he had her. At least he was not entirely alone in this vast, indifferent landscape. The terrain was changing now, becoming more rugged and less hospitable. This was old mining country, abandoned decades ago when the silver veins had played out, and the prospectors had moved on to more promising claims. Jack had passed several collapsed mine shafts in the past few miles, their timber supports rotting and dangerous, their dark mouths gaping like wounds in the earth. There was something melancholy about these places, these monuments to disappointed dreams and failed fortunes. They reminded him of his own life in a way he did not particularly enjoy contemplating. It was the sound that caught his attention first. A distant whimpering carried on the evening breeze, faint but unmistakable. Jack reined Sadie to a halt and listened, his eyes scanning the landscape for the source. The sound came again, more distinct this time, and with it came other noises as well. The nervous shuffle of hooves, the low whine of distress, the kind of sounds that spoke of suffering and need. His first instinct was to ride on. Whatever trouble lay ahead was not his concern. He had learned long ago that getting involved in other people's problems only led to complications, to attachments that would eventually have to be severed when it was time to move on. But something about those sounds would not let him go. There was a desperation in them, a plea for help that resonated with something deep inside him, some part of himself he thought he had successfully buried years ago. With a sigh that spoke of resignation rather than enthusiasm, Jack urged Sadie forward in the direction of the sounds. They crested a small rise, and what he saw in the valley below made him pull the mare to an abrupt stop, his breath catching in his throat. An old mine entrance sat nestled against a rocky hillside, its timber frame still partially intact, though clearly abandoned for many years. But it was not the mine itself that captured Jack's attention. It was what surrounded it. Animals. More animals than he could count at first glance. Horses stood in small groups, their ribs showing through their dull coats, their heads hanging low with exhaustion. Dogs of various breeds and sizes lay scattered around the mine entrance, some barely moving, others pacing restlessly as if searching for something they could not find. A few mules stood apart from the horses, their long ears drooping, their eyes hollow with neglect. Even a small herd of goats huddled together near a pile of old mining equipment, bleating softly in the gathering dusk. Jack sat frozen in his saddle, trying to make sense of what he was seeing. This was not natural. Animals did not gather like this on their own, not in such numbers, not in such a desolate place. Someone had brought them here. Someone had left them here. The realization hit him like a physical blow, and with it came a wave of anger so intense it surprised him with its strength. He dismounted slowly, his legs stiff from days in the saddle, and began making his way down the slope toward the mine. As he drew closer, the full extent of the situation became clear, and what he saw broke something inside him that he thought had long since turned to stone. The animals were starving. Their water source, a small seep spring near the mine entrance, had nearly dried up in the autumn heat. Several of the dogs were too weak to stand, lying in the dust with their tongues lolling, their breathing shallow and labored. One of the horses, a once beautiful paint mare, had collapsed near the mine entrance, her sides heaving with the effort of each breath. Jack had seen suffering before. The frontier was not a gentle place, and death was as common as sunrise for both man and beast. But this was different. This was not the natural hardship of life in a harsh land. This was cruelty, deliberate and calculated. Someone had gathered these animals, brought them to this remote location, and abandoned them to die slowly of starvation and thirst. The why of it barely mattered. The fact of it was enough to make Jack's hands shake with fury as he knelt beside the collapsed paint mare and placed a gentle hand on her neck. Her coat was rough and dirty, matted with sweat and dust, but he could feel her heart still beating beneath his palm, steady but weak. She turned her head slightly to look at him, and in her dark eyes he saw something that cut through every defense he had built over years of solitary living. Hope. Despite everything she had endured, despite the suffering and abandonment, she still had hope that help had finally arrived. Jack Morrison had spent more than 20 years convincing himself that he did not need anyone, that solitude was safer than connection, that caring about anything beyond his own survival was a fool's game in a world that gave no guarantees. But as he knelt in the dust beside that dying horse, surrounded by abandoned animals who had been left to suffer and die alone, he felt something shift inside him. These creatures had not chosen their fate. They had trusted humans who had betrayed that trust in the cruelest way possible. And now, they were paying the price for that betrayal with their lives. He stood slowly, his jaw set with determination, and looked around at the assembled animals. There were too many, far too many for one man to save. The logical part of his mind told him to mount Sadie and ride away, to report what he had found to the nearest town, and let someone else deal with the problem. But logic had never been particularly good at overruling the heart, and Jack's heart, that organ he thought had withered from disuse, was suddenly very much awake and demanding action. The first priority was water. Jack quickly assessed the situation with the practiced eye of a man who had survived in harsh country by understanding the basics of life and death. The seep spring near the mine entrance was barely more than a trickle, creating a small, muddy depression that several of the weaker animals had trampled into uselessness. He needed to find a better source, and he needed to find it quickly before the sun disappeared entirely and darkness made the work impossible. He unslung the canteen from Sadie's saddle and poured its contents into his hat, then carried it to the collapsed paint mare. She lifted her head with visible effort and drank greedily, her tongue working to capture every drop. It was not nearly enough, but it was something. Jack repeated the process with two of the dogs who lay nearest, watching as they lapped weakly at the water, their tails making feeble attempts at wagging. The gesture of gratitude, however small, made something in his chest tighten painfully. Working quickly before the light failed completely, Jack explored the area around the mine. His years of wandering had taught him to read the land, to see the subtle signs that indicated where water might be found. About 200 yards from the mine entrance, he discovered what he was looking for: a natural depression in the rock where rainwater collected, and a small underground spring fed a shallow pool. The water was clear and cold, and there was enough of it to make a difference. The problem was getting the animals to it. Many of them were too weak to walk that distance, and even if they could, moving such a large group in the failing light would be dangerous and chaotic. Jack made a decision. He would bring the water to them. It would mean countless trips back and forth, carrying water in whatever containers he could find. But there was no other option if he wanted to keep them alive through the night. Near the mine entrance, partially hidden by overgrown sagebrush, Jack found the remnants of the mining operation. Old wooden buckets, some with holes but others still serviceable, lay scattered among rusting tools and broken equipment. He gathered every container that would hold water and began the arduous process of carrying it from the pool to the animals. Trip after trip, as the sun sank lower and the temperature dropped, Jack hauled water across that 200 yards of rocky ground. The horses drank first, their desperation evident in the way they pushed against each other to reach the buckets. Jack had to be careful not to let them drink too much too fast, knowing that water shock could kill an animal as surely as dehydration. He rationed it out, bucket by bucket, moving from group to group, ensuring that even the weakest animals received their share. The dogs were next, and then the mules, who had clustered together near the mine entrance as if seeking protection in numbers. The goats, more mobile than the others, followed him back to the pool and drank directly from the source, their small hooves sure on the rocky ground. By the time full darkness settled over the valley, Jack's shoulders ached from carrying the heavy buckets, and his clothes were soaked with spilled water and sweat. But every animal had drunk, and though they were still in dire condition, at least they would not die of thirst tonight. It was a small victory. But in that moment, standing in the darkness surrounded by animals who were depending on him for their survival, it felt monumental. The next challenge was food. Jack's own supplies were limited to hardtack, jerky, and a small bag of cornmeal he had planned to stretch over several days of travel. It was nowhere near enough to feed this many animals, but it was better than nothing. He scattered the cornmeal on the ground for the horses and mules, watching as they fell upon it with desperate hunger. The dogs received the last of his jerky, torn into small pieces and distributed as fairly as he could manage in the darkness. As he worked, Jack found himself talking to the animals, his voice low and soothing in the night air. It had been so long since he had spoken to anyone or anything beyond Sadie that the sound of his own voice felt strange, almost unfamiliar. He told them they would be all right, that help had arrived, that they were not alone anymore. Whether they understood his words or simply responded to his tone, Jack could not say. But several of the dogs moved closer to him, pressing against his legs as he worked, and the horses seemed calmer, less frantic in their movements. When the immediate crisis had been addressed as much as possible, Jack built a small fire near the mine entrance. The warmth was welcome, as the desert night turned cold, but more than that, the light pushed back the darkness and gave him the opportunity to truly assess what he was dealing with. In the flickering firelight, he counted the animals more carefully. 12 horses of varying ages and breeds, though all showed signs of neglect and abuse. 15 dogs, ranging from a small terrier mix to what looked like a shepherd cross, all painfully thin. 4 mules, stoic and patient even in their suffering, and 7 goats who seemed to be in slightly better condition than the others, perhaps because they were better adapted to surviving on the sparse vegetation of the high desert. 38 animals in total. 38 lives that had been casually discarded by someone who valued them less than the effort it would have taken to care for them properly or find them decent homes. The math was staggering. The food alone would be enormous, not to mention the medical care many of them clearly needed, the time and effort required to rehabilitate animals who had been traumatized by abandonment and starvation. Jack should have been daunted by the impossibility of the task before him. Any reasonable man would have been. But as he sat by the fire watching the animals settle into uneasy sleep around him, feeling the warmth of the dogs who had curled up nearby, listening to the soft sounds of breathing and the occasional shuffle of hooves in the darkness, he felt something he had not experienced in more years than he could remember. He felt needed, not just useful, not just employed for his skills with horses or his strong back, but genuinely needed by creatures who had nowhere else to turn and no one else to depend on. The collapsed paint mare had managed to lift her head and was watching him from across the fire, her eyes reflecting the flames. Jack met her gaze and made her a silent promise. He would not abandon them the way they had been abandoned. He would not leave them to die alone in this forgotten place. Whatever it took, however impossible the task might seem, he would find a way to save them. All of them. Dawn came cold and clear, painting the desert in shades of gold and purple that would have been beautiful under different circumstances. Jack had not slept. He had spent the night keeping the fire burning, making additional trips to the water source, and checking on the animals who seemed most at risk. The paint mare had survived the night, which he took as a good sign, though she was still too weak to stand. 3 of the dogs had pressed themselves against him as he sat by the fire, seeking warmth and reassurance, and he had let them stay there, finding unexpected comfort in their presence. As the light strengthened, Jack began to form a plan. The nearest town was Copper Springs, about a day-and-a-half ride to the east. He would need supplies, feed for the horses and mules, food for the dogs, medical supplies, rope and blankets. He would also need help. There was no way he could care for this many animals alone, not if he wanted to give them a real chance at survival, but the thought of leaving them, even temporarily, filled him with an anxiety that surprised him with its intensity. What if something happened while he was gone? What if the weaker animals did not make it through another day? He was still wrestling with this dilemma when he heard the sound of an approaching horse. Jack stood quickly, his hand moving instinctively to the revolver at his hip. In country like this, unexpected visitors could mean trouble, and he was in no mood to deal with claim jumpers or drifters looking for easy pickings. But as the rider crested the rise above the mine, Jack relaxed slightly. It was a woman riding a sturdy buckskin gelding, and she was alone. She guided her horse down the slope with the confidence of someone who had grown up in the saddle, her dark hair pulled back in a practical braid, her clothing simple but well-made. As she drew closer, Jack could see that she was perhaps in her mid-30s, with a weathered face that spoke of years spent outdoors and eyes that took in the scene before her with quick intelligence. She reined in her horse about 20 feet from the fire and sat there for a moment, surveying the gathered animals with an expression that shifted from surprise to shock to barely controlled anger. "Dear God," she said finally, her voice carrying clearly in the morning air. "How long have they been here?" Jack found his voice rusty from disuse and the long night. "I found them yesterday evening. Near as I can tell, they've been abandoned here for at least a week, maybe longer." The woman dismounted with quick, efficient movements and began walking among the animals, her hands gentle as she examined them, her face growing darker with each discovery. She knelt beside the paint mare, running her hands over the horse's protruding ribs, checking her eyes and gums with the practiced touch of someone who knew horses intimately. When she looked up at Jack, her eyes were bright with unshed tears, but her voice was steady and hard as iron. "I know who did this," she said. "Or at least I can guess. There's a man named Caleb Rossiter who's been running a trading operation out of Copper Springs. Buys up livestock cheap, promises to find them good homes, charges people for the service. I've had my suspicions about him for months, but I never thought..." She stopped, her jaw clenching. "I never thought anyone could be this cruel." Jack felt a cold fury settle in his gut at the confirmation that this suffering had been deliberate, calculated. You know this Rossiter? Everyone in Copper Springs knows him. He's been operating there for about 2 years, always careful to stay just on the right side of legal. People trust him because he talks a good game about animal welfare and finding perfect homes for unwanted livestock. She stood, brushing dust from her knees. I'm Sarah Brennan. I run a small ranch about 10 miles from here. I was out checking on some strays when I saw your fire. Jack Morrison. He gestured at the animals around them. I was just passing through when I heard them. Didn't have much choice but to stop. Sarah looked at him appraisingly, and Jack had the uncomfortable feeling that she was seeing more than he wanted to reveal. Most men would have ridden on, especially a drifter traveling alone. It was not a question, but Jack answered anyway. Maybe, but I'm not most men, I guess. No, Sarah said softly, looking around at the animals who had begun to stir with the morning light. I don't suppose you are. She turned back to him with decision in her eyes. We need to get them help. Food, medical supplies, proper shelter. My ranch isn't big, but I've got space in my barn and some pasture land. We can bring the weakest ones there first, then figure out what to do with the rest. The relief Jack felt at her words was almost overwhelming. He had been prepared to face this alone, to somehow find a way to save these animals through sheer stubborn determination. But having help, having someone who understood what needed to be done and was willing to do it, changed everything. I've got a little money saved. Not much, but enough to buy feed and supplies. Sarah shook her head. Keep your money. I've got enough to get us started, and once word gets out about what Rossiter did, there'll be plenty of people in Copper Springs willing to help. The decent folks, anyway. She began assessing the animals again, this time with an eye toward triage. We'll need to move fast. Some of these animals won't last another 2 days without proper care. Can you ride to my ranch with me? I'll send my foreman back with a wagon and supplies while we start treating the worst cases here. Jack hesitated, thinking of his original plans to keep drifting, to avoid entanglements and commitments. Then he looked at the paint mare, still lying in the dust but watching him with those hopeful eyes, and at the dogs who had stayed close to him through the night, and at all the other animals who were depending on strangers to save them from a fate they had not deserved. His old life seemed suddenly distant and insignificant, a pale shadow compared to the vivid reality of what was happening here and now. I'll help however I can, he said, and meant it with an intensity that surprised him. For as long as it takes. Sarah smiled then, the first real smile he had seen from her, and it transformed her face from merely pleasant to genuinely warm. Good, because something tells me this is going to take a while. She moved toward her horse, then paused and looked back at him. Fair warning, Jack Morrison. Once you start down this road, once you commit to saving animals that nobody else wants, it has a way of changing you, of making you see the world differently. Jack thought about the 20-odd years he had spent drifting alone, avoiding connections, protecting himself from the pain of loss by never allowing himself to care about anything too much. He thought about the loneliness that had become as familiar as his own heartbeat, the emptiness that he had convinced himself was freedom. And then he looked at the animals around him, these abandoned creatures who had survived against impossible odds and were still fighting to live, still hoping that someone would finally see their worth. The ride to Sarah's ranch took less than an hour, following a narrow trail that wound through rocky terrain and stands of juniper trees. Jack rode in silence for most of the journey, his mind churning with plans and worries about the animals they had left behind. Sarah seemed to understand his preoccupation and did not press him for conversation, though he caught her glancing at him occasionally with an expression he could not quite read. The Brennan Ranch was modest but well maintained, with a sturdy barn, several corrals, and a small house that looked like it had been built to withstand the harsh desert weather. As they rode into the yard, a lean man in his 50s emerged from the barn, wiping his hands on a rag. His weathered face creased into a smile when he saw Sarah, but the smile faded when he noticed her expression. "Tom," Sarah said as she dismounted, "we've got an emergency. There's a group of abandoned animals at the old Silverton mine. Horses, dogs, mules, goats, maybe 40 of them, all in bad shape. We need to load up the wagon with feed, water barrels, and every medical supply we have, and we need to do it now." Tom's face hardened with understanding. "Rossiter, that's my guess." Sarah was already striding toward the barn. "Jack here found them last night. He's been keeping them alive on his own, but they need more help than one man can provide." Tom turned to Jack, extending a calloused hand. "Tom Brennan, Sarah's my daughter. Any man who'd stop to help animals in need is welcome here." The handshake was firm and genuine, and Jack felt some of the tension in his shoulders ease. He had grown so accustomed to being an outsider, to being viewed with suspicion by settled folk, that simple acceptance felt almost foreign. The next hour was a flurry of organized chaos. Tom and Sarah worked with the efficiency of people who had done difficult tasks together for years, loading the wagon with sacks of grain, bales of hay, water barrels, rope, blankets, and a wooden box filled with medical supplies. Jack helped where he could, following directions and learning the layout of the ranch. Sarah's operation was clearly successful despite its modest size. The horses in her corrals were healthy and well cared for. The barn was clean and organized, and everything spoke of someone who took pride in their work. As they loaded the last of the supplies, a young man rode into the yard on a gray gelding. He was perhaps 25, with an easy smile and the kind of confident bearing that suggested he had grown up comfortable in his own skin. When he saw Sarah, his face lit up in a way that made Jack wonder about the nature of their relationship. "Sarah, I was hoping to catch you before you headed out to check the south pasture," he called out, then noticed the loaded wagon and Jack's presence. His expression shifted to curiosity. "What's going on?" "Michael." Sarah's tone was pleasant but distracted. "We've found a group of abandoned animals at the old Silverton mine. We're heading out there now with supplies. Can you ride into Copper Springs and spread the word? We're going to need volunteers, more supplies, and someone needs to track down Caleb Rossiter before he decides to disappear." Michael's easy smile vanished, replaced by cold anger. "Rossiter, I knew that son of a gun was crooked. How bad is it?" "Bad," Jack said, speaking up for the first time. 38 animals, all starved and dehydrated. Some of them won't make it even with help." Michael looked at him properly for the first time, his eyes assessing Jack in a way that men often did when encountering a stranger who had earned the attention of a woman they cared about. Whatever he saw must have satisfied him, because he nodded and extended his hand. "Michael Cartwright. I run the feed store in Copper Springs. I'll get the word out and bring back whatever supplies I can gather. Should be able to make it back by this evening." "Thank you," Sarah said, and there was warmth in her voice that confirmed Jack's suspicions about their relationship. "And Michael, be careful. If Rossiter realizes we've found his dumping ground, he might do something desperate." "I'll bring the sheriff," Michael replied. He tipped his hat to Jack, gave Sarah a look loaded with unspoken communication, and rode out at a gallop. The journey back to the mine seemed longer than the journey away from it, perhaps because Jack's anxiety increased with every passing minute. What if the paint mare had succumbed during their absence? What if the weaker dogs had given up? What if predators had discovered the vulnerable animals and attacked? He knew his fears were probably irrational, but he could not shake them. When they finally crested the rise above the mine, Jack's heart clenched at the sight below. The animals had not moved much from where he had left them, still clustered around the mine entrance as if seeking protection from invisible threats. But they were alive. All of them. The paint mare had even managed to lift herself to a sitting position, though she clearly lacked the strength to stand. Sarah and Tom wasted no time getting to work. Tom began distributing hay and grain to the horses and mules, while Sarah focused on the weakest animals, checking their vital signs and administering what immediate care she could. Jack found himself assigned to water duty again, this time with proper buckets and the benefit of daylight. He made trip after trip from the pool to the animals, ensuring everyone had their fill. As he worked, several of the dogs began following him, staying close to his heels as if afraid he might disappear if they let him out of their sight. A small terrier mix with one ear standing up and one flopping down seemed particularly attached, pressing against his leg whenever he paused. Jack found himself reaching down to scratch behind the dog's ears, surprised by how natural the gesture felt. "That one's chosen you," Sarah said, appearing beside him with an armload of blankets. She was smiling, but there was something serious in her eyes. Dogs know. They can tell who has a good heart, even when the person themselves has forgotten. Jack felt heat rise in his cheeks at the unexpected compliment. "I'm nobody special. Just doing what anyone would do." "No," Sarah said firmly, kneeling to wrap a blanket around one of the shivering dogs. Most people wouldn't have stopped. Most people would have convinced themselves it wasn't their problem. You chose differently, and that makes you special, whether you want to admit it or not. Before Jack could formulate a response to that unsettling observation, Tom called out from near the paint mare, "Sarah, you'd better come look at this." There was something in his tone that made both of them drop what they were doing and hurry over. The paint mare was trying to stand. Her legs trembled with the effort, her muscles weak from days of starvation, but there was determination in every line of her body. Tom had positioned himself to help support her weight if she started to fall, but he was letting her try on her own first. Jack moved to the mare's other side instinctively, ready to catch her if needed. With a tremendous effort that seemed to drain every reserve of strength she possessed, the paint mare heaved herself to her feet. She swayed dangerously, and Jack's hands shot out to steady her, feeling the violent trembling of her exhausted muscles. But she was standing. After more than a week of lying in the dust waiting to die, she was on her feet again. "Easy, girl," Jack murmured, his voice rough with emotion he had not expected to feel. "Easy now. You're going to be all right. We've got you." The mare turned her head slightly to look at him, and in that moment, Jack Morrison felt something inside him that had been frozen for 2 decades begin to thaw. It was painful, that thawing, like blood returning to numbed limbs, but it was also necessary and right and somehow inevitable. By mid-afternoon, the old Silverton mine had transformed from a place of death into something resembling organized chaos. Michael had returned from Copper Springs with not just supplies but people. A dozen townspeople had dropped what they were doing and ridden out to help, bringing food, water, medical supplies, and most importantly, willing hands. The transformation in the camp was remarkable. Where Jack had spent the night alone with desperate animals and dwindling hope, there was now a community united in purpose. Dr. Eleanor Hayes, a veterinarian who had recently set up practice in Copper Springs, moved among the animals with calm efficiency. She was a woman in her late 40s with steel-gray hair pulled back in a severe bun, and hands that moved with absolute confidence as she examined each animal, making notes in a small leather journal. Jack watched her work with admiration, noting how even the most frightened animals seemed to calm under her touch. "This paint mare," Dr. Hayes said, running her hands along the horse's neck and shoulders. "She's got spirit, good strong bone structure under all this neglect. With proper care, she'll make a full recovery." She looked up at Jack, who had not left the mare's side since she had managed to stand. "You planning to keep her?" The question caught Jack off guard. Keep her? He was a drifter. a man who owned nothing but what fit in his saddlebags and could be carried on one horse. The idea of keeping an animal, of being responsible for another creature's well-being beyond the immediate crisis, was so foreign to his way of life that he almost laughed at the absurdity. But when he looked down at the paint mare, at the way she leaned slightly against him as if drawing strength from his presence, the laugh died in his throat. "I don't know," he said honestly. "I'm not set up for keeping anything. I move around a lot." Dr. Hayes gave him a look that suggested she had heard that kind of excuse before and was not particularly impressed by it. "Well, you've got some time to figure it out. She's not going anywhere for at least a few weeks. Needs to build up her strength before she can be moved any significant distance." She made another note in her journal. "In the meantime, you might want to give her a name. Makes it easier to bond, and bonding helps with recovery." Jack wanted to protest that he was not planning to bond with the horse, that this was a temporary situation and he would be moving on as soon as the animals were safe. But the words felt hollow even in his own mind. The truth was, he had already bonded with the paint mare. It had happened the moment he knelt beside her in the dust and felt her heart still beating beneath his palm, still fighting to live despite everything she had endured. "Hope," he heard himself say. "I'll call her Hope." Sarah, who had been working nearby distributing grain to the other horses, looked up at the name and smiled. It was a knowing smile, the kind that suggested she understood more about what was happening to Jack than he understood himself. "That's a good name. Suits her." As the afternoon wore on, Jack found himself observing the people who had come to help. There was Martha Wilson, a widow in her 60s who ran the general store in Copper Springs and had brought enough donated supplies to fill 2 wagons. She moved among the dogs with gentle efficiency, speaking to them in a soft voice that seemed to calm even the most traumatized animals. Young Billy Chen, whose family owned the restaurant in town, had brought leftover meat scraps and was carefully hand-feeding the weakest dogs, his face serious with concentration. The Ramirez brothers, who worked as ranch hands on various spreads in the area, had used their roping skills to create makeshift corrals separating the animals into manageable groups. What struck Jack most forcefully was the way these people worked together, anticipating each other's needs, supporting each other without being asked. This was community in action, and it was something he had almost forgotten existed. In his years of drifting, he had become so accustomed to solving problems alone, to relying only on himself, that he had forgotten what it felt like to be part of something larger. To work alongside others toward a common goal, to be able to ask for help and have it freely given. Tom Brennan appeared at his elbow, carrying 2 tin cups of coffee. He offered one to Jack, then stood beside him in companionable silence, both men watching the organized rescue effort unfolding before them. After a few minutes, Tom spoke, his voice quiet and thoughtful. "Sarah told me you were just passing through when you found them. That true?" Jack nodded, sipping the strong, bitter coffee. "Was heading north. No particular destination in mind. You been drifting long?" 22 years, give or take." Tom was quiet for another moment, seeming to consider this. "That's a long time to be without a place to call home." "Seemed easier that way," Jack replied, though even as he said it, he was not sure he believed it anymore. "No ties, no obligations. Free to go wherever the work was." "Free," Tom repeated, and there was something in the way he said the word that made it sound like a question rather than a statement. Or just lonely. The observation hit closer to the mark than Jack wanted to admit. He had spent so many years telling himself that his solitary existence was a choice, a preference, that he had almost convinced himself it was true. But standing here surrounded by people who had dropped everything to help animals they did not know, watching Hope lean against him as if he were the only solid thing in her world, Feeling the small terrier mix pressed against his leg, he could not maintain the fiction any longer. Maybe both, he admitted quietly. Tom nodded as if this was the answer he had expected. You know, Sarah's been running that ranch mostly on her own since her mother passed 3 years ago. I help when I can, but these old bones aren't as reliable as they used to be. She could use a good hand who knows horses and isn't afraid of hard work. He paused, then added, if you were interested in staying for a while, just until you figure out what comes next. Jack opened his mouth to refuse, to explain that he did not stay anywhere long enough to be useful, that he was not the kind of man anyone should depend on. But before he could speak, Sarah called out from near the mine entrance. Jack, can you come here? There's something you need to see. He and Tom made their way to where Sarah stood with Dr. Hayes and several others, all of them looking down into the mine shaft. The entrance had been partially boarded up, but there was a gap large enough for a person to squeeze through. Sarah held a lantern, its light pushing back the darkness just enough to illuminate the first few feet of the tunnel. Listen, she said, holding up her hand for silence. Jack strained his ears and heard it. A soft whimpering, weak but persistent, coming from somewhere deep inside the mine. His blood ran cold as he realized what it meant. There were more animals down there. Animals that had either wandered into the mine seeking shelter or had been deliberately shut inside. Animals that had been trapped in the darkness, while the others at least had light and open air. How many? He asked, his voice tight with controlled fury. Can't tell from up here, Dr. Hayes replied. But that sound is definitely canine. Probably dogs, possibly puppies based on the pitch of the crying. Jack was already moving toward the mine entrance before anyone could stop him. The gap in the boards was narrow, barely wide enough for his shoulders, but he managed to squeeze through. Behind him, he heard Sarah calling his name, but he did not stop. Those animals had been alone in the dark for days, maybe longer. Every minute they waited was another minute of suffering. The tunnel was dark and close, the air stale and oppressive. Jack's lantern cast dancing shadows on the rough-hewn walls as he moved deeper into the mine. The whimpering grew louder, more desperate, punctuated now by scratching sounds as if the animals could hear him coming and were trying to reach him. His heart hammered against his ribs, partly from the physical exertion of navigating the treacherous tunnel, but mostly from the growing dread of what he would find. The tunnel opened into a wider chamber, and in the light of his lantern, Jack saw them. 5 puppies, no more than a few months old, huddled together in the corner. They were filthy, emaciated, their eyes reflecting the lamplight like tiny mirrors. But they were alive. Against all odds, they had survived in this darkness. Jack set the lantern down carefully and moved toward the puppies with slow, deliberate movements. They shrank back at first, frightened by this large stranger emerging from the darkness. But he kept his voice low and soothing, the same tone he had used with Hope and the other animals. Gradually, the puppies' fear gave way to desperate hope. The boldest of them, a little brown and white female with one ear that stood straight up, took a tentative step forward. Then another. Then she was stumbling toward him, her tail wagging weakly, her whole body trembling with the effort of movement. Jack scooped her up, feeling how light she was, how her bones pressed sharp against his palms. She licked his face with a dry tongue, making small whimpering sounds that broke his heart into pieces. The other puppies, emboldened by their sister's courage, began crawling toward him as well. Within moments, Jack found himself surrounded by 5 tiny, desperate creatures who somehow still had enough trust left to believe that humans might help rather than harm them. Getting them out of the mine was a challenge. The puppies were too weak to walk the full distance back through the tunnel, and Jack could not carry all 5 at once. He ended up making 2 trips, carrying 3 puppies the first time and returning for the remaining 2. Each time he emerged from the mine entrance, grimy and exhausted, Sarah was there waiting. On his second emergence, she took the puppies from his arms without a word and carried them to where Dr. Hayes had set up a makeshift examination area. When Jack finally climbed out for the last time, covered in mine dust and sweat, his hands shaking with the after effects of adrenaline, he found the entire rescue camp gathered around the puppies. Martha Wilson had already begun cleaning them with warm water and soft cloths, crooning to them as she worked. Dr. Hayes was examining each one, her face grave but not hopeless. The puppies were responding to the attention with pathetic gratitude, their tails attempting to wag despite their weakness. "They're shepherd mixes," Dr. Hayes announced after her examination. "Maybe 3-4 months old, severely malnourished and dehydrated, but no obvious injuries or infections. With proper care, they should all make it." She looked up at Jack, who stood watching from a few feet away. "You saved their lives. Another day or two in that mine, and it would have been too late." Jack did not know what to say to that. He had only done what needed to be done, what any decent person would have done in the same situation. But the way everyone was looking at him, with a mixture of respect and admiration, suggested they saw his actions as somehow extraordinary. It made him uncomfortable, this attention. He was not a hero. He was just a man who had happened to be in the right place at the right time. Sarah appeared at his elbow with a canteen of water. "Drink," she ordered. "You look like you're about to keel over." He obeyed, grateful for the cool water and the excuse to have something to do with his hands. As he drank, Sarah studied him with that penetrating gaze of hers. "You know, what you did in there was incredibly dangerous. That mine could have collapsed. The air could have been bad. You could have been trapped." "The puppies were already trapped," Jack replied simply. "Somebody had to get them out." "Yes, but most people would have waited, sent for help, made a plan. You just went in." There was no accusation in her voice, just observation. "That's either very brave or very foolish, and I'm not sure which." "Maybe both," Jack said, echoing his earlier conversation with Tom. He found himself smiling slightly despite his exhaustion. "Seems to be a theme for me today." The evening brought more surprises. Michael Cartwright returned with the sheriff, a lean, hard-eyed man named James Crawford, who listened to the accounts of what they had found with a face like granite. He took notes, asked questions, and examined the animals himself. When he had gathered enough information, he stood and addressed the assembled group. "This is deliberate animal cruelty on a scale I've never seen before. Caleb Rossiter has some serious questions to answer, and if he can't provide satisfactory answers, he's going to be spending a considerable amount of time in a jail cell." Sheriff Crawford paused, his eyes sweeping across the rescued animals. "I want to thank all of you for what you've done here today. This kind of community response, this kind of compassion, it's what makes a town worth living in." As the sun began to set, casting long shadows across the desert, decisions had to be made about what to do with the animals overnight. The weakest ones, including Hope and the 5 puppies, would be transported to Sarah's ranch, where they could receive constant care. The healthier animals would remain at the mine, with volunteers taking shifts to watch over them through the night. Jack found himself volunteering for the first watch without conscious thought, unable to imagine leaving them alone in the darkness. Sarah did not argue with his decision, though he saw concern flash across her face. Instead, she organized the watch schedule so that Jack would not be alone. Tom would take the second watch, and several others had volunteered for the remaining shifts through the night and following day. Before she left with the wagon carrying Hope and the puppies, Sarah pressed a bundle into Jack's hands. "Food, coffee, an extra blanket," she said. "It gets cold out here at night. Take care of yourself as well as the animals, understood?" There was something in her voice, a note of genuine worry that caught Jack off guard. When was the last time anyone had worried about him? When was the last time anyone had cared whether he was warm or fed or safe? "I will," he promised, and meant it. As darkness fell over the old Silverton mine for the second night, Jack sat by the fire and took stock of how much had changed in 24 hours. Yesterday, at this time, he had been alone with dying animals and no clear plan beyond getting them through the night. Now he was surrounded by evidence of what community could accomplish when people decided to act. The animals had food, water, medical care, and most importantly, they had hope. Real hope, not just the desperate kind that comes from having no other option. The small terrier mix who had attached himself to Jack earlier in the day settled against his leg, and Jack reached down to scratch behind his ears. The dog made a contented sound, pressing closer, and Jack felt that strange warmth in his chest again, the feeling of being needed, the feeling of mattering to someone, even if that someone was a scruffy little dog with one floppy ear. Billy Chen, who had volunteered to share the first watch, appeared with 2 plates of food. "My mother sent this," he said, handing one to Jack. "Said anyone working this hard needs proper feeding." The food was simple but delicious, rice and vegetables and tender pieces of chicken that Jack savored slowly. As they ate, Billy talked about his family's restaurant, about growing up in Copper Springs, about his dreams of maybe opening his own place someday. Jack found himself listening with genuine interest, asking questions, engaging in conversation in a way he had not done in years. It felt rusty and uncertain at first, like a skill he had once possessed, but had almost forgotten how to use. But gradually it became easier, natural, almost comfortable. When Billy asked about Jack's own history, Jack found himself sharing more than he usually would. Not everything, not the painful parts he kept locked away, but enough. Enough to be real. Enough to be human. The night deepened, and the stars emerged in their thousands, painting the desert sky with cold fire. The animals settled into sleep, their breathing steady and peaceful in a way it had not been the previous night. Jack sat with the terrier mix in his lap and Billy dozing against a rock nearby, and felt something shift in his understanding of himself. For 22 years, he had believed that freedom meant having no ties, no obligations, no one depending on him. He had thought that solitude was safety, that caring was weakness. But sitting here under the vast desert sky, surrounded by animals who had been saved because people chose to care, because a community decided that these lives mattered, Jack began to understand that he had been wrong. Freedom was not the absence of connection. It was the choice to form connections that mattered. And caring was not weakness. It was perhaps the bravest thing a person could do. The third day after the discovery brought Caleb Rossiter's reckoning. Sheriff Crawford found him trying to leave town with a wagon loaded with his belongings and whatever cash he had managed to gather. The arrest was swift and public, taking place in the middle of Copper Springs Main Street where everyone could see. By the time Jack rode into town with Sarah to purchase additional supplies, a crowd had gathered outside the sheriff's office, their mood ugly and vengeful. Jack had never seen Caleb Rossiter before, but he recognized the type immediately. The man was in his 40s, well-dressed and smooth-talking, with the kind of face that inspired trust in people who did not look too closely. He was protesting his arrest loudly, claiming it was all a misunderstanding, that he had meant to return to the mine, that circumstances beyond his control had prevented him from caring for the animals properly. His excuses fell on deaf ears. Too many people had seen the evidence of his cruelty firsthand. "You left them to die," Martha Wilson shouted from the crowd, her voice shaking with rage. "Helpless animals who trusted you, and you left them to starve in the desert." "I was coming back," Rossiter insisted, but even as he said it, his eyes darted around looking for escape routes. "I just needed time to arrange proper homes for them all. You people don't understand the complications involved in animal welfare work." Sheriff Crawford's hand clamped down on Rossiter's shoulder, his grip visibly tightening. The only thing complicated here is how you're going to explain to a judge why 40 animals were found dying of starvation at an abandoned mine. Save your words for the trial." He hauled Rossiter toward the jail, and the crowd parted to let them through, their faces hard with judgment. Jack watched the scene unfold with grim satisfaction. Justice was being served, but it felt hollow somehow. No punishment could undo the suffering those animals had endured. No jail sentence could give back the lives of the ones who had not survived other animals in other places that Rossiter had probably abandoned over the years. The best they could do now was prevent him from hurting any more creatures and care for the ones they had saved. Inside the general store, Martha Wilson had set up a donation station for the rescue effort. There were jars for cash contributions, boxes for supplies, and a large ledger where people could sign up to adopt animals once they were healthy enough to be placed. Jack was stunned by the community's response. In just 3 days, the people of Copper Springs had donated enough money to cover veterinary care for all the animals, with enough left over to purchase feed and supplies for months. The adoption list was already 2 pages long, with families carefully noting which animals they were interested in and what kind of home they could provide. Sarah stood beside him, reading through the adoption applications with a critical eye. "This one wants Hope," she said, pointing to an entry. "The Patterson family. They run a small ranch about 20 miles south. Good people, good land. They've had horses before and know how to care for them properly." She looked up at Jack. "What do you think?" The question hit him like a physical blow. What did he think? Hope was not his horse. He had no claim on her beyond having been the one to find her and help keep her alive. The logical thing was to let her go to a good home where she would be cared for and valued. But the thought of her belonging to someone else, of not seeing her gentle eyes or feeling her lean against him for support, created an ache in his chest that surprised him with its intensity. "I think," he said slowly, carefully, "that maybe I should keep her myself." Sarah's face lit up with a smile that transformed her features. "I was hoping you'd say that." She drew a line through the Patterson family's entry. "And what about that little terrier mix? The one that's been following you around like a shadow?" Jack had been trying not to think about the terrier whom he had started mentally calling Scout because of the way he was always alert, always watching. "Sarah, I'm not set up for keeping animals. I don't have a place, don't have steady work. It wouldn't be fair to them." "About that," Sarah said, setting down the ledger and turning to face him fully. "I meant what my father said the other day about needing help on the ranch. It's not a grand operation, and I can't pay as much as the bigger spreads, but there's a cabin on the property that's sitting empty. It needs work, but it's structurally sound. You could stay there, help with the horses and general ranch work, and have a place for Hope and Scout to live properly." She paused, then added quietly, "If you wanted to stop drifting for a while." The offer was generous, more generous than Jack deserved. A job, a home, a place to keep the animals he had somehow become responsible for. It was everything he had not known he wanted, presented to him like a gift he had not earned. And that was the problem. He had not earned it. He was just a drifter who had happened to do the right thing at the right moment. That did not make him someone people should depend on, someone who could be trusted to stay when staying got difficult. "I don't know," he said honestly. "I appreciate the offer, Sarah. I really do. But I've been on my own for a long time. I'm not sure I know how to be any other way." "You've been part of a community for 3 days now," Sarah pointed out. "Seems to me you know how just fine. You just have to decide if you want to." Before Jack could respond to that uncomfortable truth, Michael Cartwright entered the store, his face flushed with excitement. "Sarah, Jack, you need to come see this. Dr. Hayes has news about the animals." They followed him out to the street where a wagon was parked, and Dr. Hayes stood with her medical bag, looking tired but pleased, Around her, several of the rescued dogs sat or lay in the wagon bed, looking dramatically better than they had 3 days ago. Their coats were cleaner, their eyes brighter, and most telling of all, their tails were wagging. "I've examined every animal thoroughly," Dr. Hayes announced to the gathering crowd. "With the exception of 3 horses who need extended veterinary care and will stay at Sarah's ranch, all the animals are healthy enough to be placed in their new homes. It's nothing short of miraculous, considering where they were just 72 hours ago." A cheer went up from the assembled townspeople, and Jack felt hands clapping him on the back, people thanking him as if he had performed some kind of miracle. He wanted to protest that he had not done it alone, that it had been a community effort, that dozens of people deserved credit for this outcome. But the words stuck in his throat as he saw the results of their collective action. Animals who had been dying were now thriving. Creatures who had given up hope had found reasons to trust again. The little terrier mix, Scout, pushed through the crowd and sat directly on Jack's boots, looking up at him with absolute devotion. One of the puppies from the mine, the brave little female who had been first to approach Jack in the darkness, climbed out of the wagon and toddled over to press against his leg. They were choosing him, these animals, claiming him as surely as if they had spoken the words aloud. "Looks like you've made some decisions for you," Sarah said softly, watching the scene with amusement and something deeper in her eyes. "Animals know who their people are. You can fight it all you want, but they've already decided you're theirs." That evening, Jack rode out to Sarah's ranch to check on Hope and the other animals receiving extended care. The paint mare was in a paddock near the barn, and when she saw him approaching, she nickered softly and walked to the fence. Her movement was still slow and careful, but it was movement, powered by muscles that were beginning to rebuild their strength. Jack climbed the fence and stood beside her, running his hands over her coat, feeling the changes that 3 days of good food and care had wrought. "I'm thinking about staying," he told her quietly, as if confessing a secret. "Taking Sarah up on her offer, getting that cabin fixed up, having a place where you could live properly, where Scout could have a yard to patrol, where that bossy little puppy could grow up safe." Hope turned her head to look at him, and Jack could have sworn he saw understanding in her gentle eyes. "It scares me," he admitted. "Staying in one place, depending on people, letting people depend on me. What if I mess it up? What if I let everyone down?" Hope bumped her nose against his chest, a gentle gesture that somehow conveyed reassurance. Jack found himself laughing, the sound rusty but genuine. "You're right. I'm overthinking this." He scratched behind her ears, feeling the peace that came from being near her. "All right then. We'll stay. We'll see what happens when a drifter tries to put down roots." As he stood there in the gathering darkness with Hope, Jack thought about all the things he had believed about himself for so many years, that he was better off alone, that caring about others was too risky, that home was a trap rather than a sanctuary. Every one of those beliefs had been challenged in the past 3 days, tested against the reality of what he had experienced and found wanting. The cabin on Sarah's property was smaller than Jack had expected, but it had good bones. The roof needed patching, the windows needed new panes, and the interior required a thorough cleaning that would take days to complete properly. But it had a solid stone fireplace, wooden floors that just needed sanding, and most importantly, it had a small barn attached where Hope could shelter from the weather. Jack stood in the doorway on his 4th morning in Copper Springs, surveying what would become his home, and felt something he had not experienced in over 2 decades. He felt possibility. Tom Brennan appeared with a wagon loaded with lumber, tools, and supplies. "Figured you could use some help getting this place livable," he said, climbing down with the creaky movements of a man whose joints protested physical labor. "I'm not as spry as I used to be, but I can still swing a hammer when needed." Over the next several hours, they worked together in companionable silence punctuated by occasional conversation. Tom had the easy manner of someone comfortable in his own skin, asking questions without prying, offering advice without being pushy. As they repaired the roof, he told Jack about his wife, Sarah's mother, who had died 3 years earlier after a long illness. "She was the heart of this place," Tom said, his voice thick with emotion that time had not entirely healed. "When she passed, it felt like the light went out. Sarah took it hard, threw herself into running the ranch like work could fill the hole her mother left. I worry about her sometimes, about how she's so focused on taking care of everyone and everything else that she forgets to take care of herself." Jack understood that impulse more than he wanted to admit. Caring for the rescued animals had given him purpose, direction, a reason to get up each morning that went beyond mere survival. It made sense that Sarah would find similar solace in work, in being useful to others. As they continued working, Jack found himself watching for Sarah around the ranch, noticing the way she moved among the animals with confident grace, the way she spoke to everyone with genuine warmth, the way her face lit up when one of the rescued animals showed improvement. By midday, several other townspeople had arrived to help with the cabin repairs. Michael Cartwright brought glass for the windows and showed Jack how to properly seal the panes. Martha Wilson arrived with curtains she had sewn herself, along with basic household supplies, dish towels, cooking utensils, and a set of sturdy dishes. Billy Chen's mother sent food enough to feed everyone twice over, and Billy himself helped Jack build shelves and repair the cabin's small kitchen. This was what community meant, Jack realized, not just showing up in emergencies, but helping with the ordinary, everyday work of building a life. These people were investing their time and labor in him, a stranger who had been passing through just days ago. They were welcoming him not because of what he could do for them, but simply because he had proven himself willing to help when help was needed. The realization was humbling and overwhelming in equal measure. Scout had taken up permanent residence at Jack's heels, following him from task to task with devoted attention. Whenever Jack sat down to rest, the little dog would curl up against his leg, sighing contentedly as if this was exactly where he belonged. The brave puppy from the mine, whom Jack had started calling Daisy for the way she turned her face up to the sun, explored the cabin and surrounding area with boundless curiosity, always returning to Jack when she needed reassurance. "You're collecting quite the family," Sarah observed, appearing with a pitcher of cool water and cups for the workers. She had been helping Dr. Hayes with the remaining animals at the old Silverton mine, coordinating their placement into the homes that had been selected from the adoption applications. "Scout and Daisy have clearly claimed you. Hope follows you around the paddock like a puppy herself. You realize what this means, don't you?" Jack accepted a cup of water, grateful for the coolness against his parched throat. "What does it mean?" "It means you're responsible for them now. It means you're not drifting anymore. Not really. You've put down roots whether you meant to or not." She said it matter-of-factly, without judgment, but Jack felt the truth of her words settle into his bones. She was right. He had committed himself, without quite realizing it, had made choices that bound him to this place and these creatures who depended on him. "I suppose I have," he admitted. "Still feels strange, though, thinking of myself as someone who stays." "Give it time," Sarah said gently. "Everything feels strange at first. Then one day you wake up and realize strange has become familiar, and familiar has become home." She paused, then added with a smile that held both warmth and challenge, "Besides, we're not letting you go easily. You've become part of this community whether you're ready for it or not." By evening, the cabin was transformed. The roof no longer leaked, the windows were sealed against the weather, and the interior was clean and furnished with basic necessities. Jack stood in what was now his home, looking at the bed Martha had insisted he take, the table Michael had helped him build, the shelves stocked with supplies from various donors. It was modest, but functional, and more than that, it was his. The first place he could truly call his own since he had left his family's farm 22 years ago. That night, Jack made his first meal in his new kitchen, simple beans and cornbread cooked over the fireplace. Scout and Daisy shared his food, and afterward they all sat on the small porch watching the stars emerge. Hope stood nearby in her paddock, close enough that Jack could hear her contented breathing. The sounds of the night desert wrapped around them, cicadas and distant coyotes and the whisper of wind through sagebrush, and Jack felt something settle in his chest. Not quite contentment, not yet, but something approaching peace. The following week brought the trial of Caleb Rossiter. The courtroom was packed with townspeople who had come to see justice served. Jack testified about finding the animals, describing in detail the condition they had been in and the suffering they had clearly endured. Sarah spoke about the rescue effort and the community's response. Dr. Hayes provided medical testimony about the extent of the neglect and abuse. One by one, witnesses painted a picture of systematic cruelty that left no room for doubt or mercy. Rossiter's defense attorney tried to argue that his client had simply been overwhelmed by circumstances, that he had intended to return, but had been prevented by various mishaps. But when the prosecutor produced evidence of 3 previous incidents in other towns where Rossiter had abandoned animals under similar circumstances, the defense collapsed. The jury deliberated for less than an hour before returning with a guilty verdict on all counts. Judge Morrison, a stern woman in her 60s who was known for her fairness and her love of animals, pronounced sentence with barely contained anger. Mr. Rossiter, you have demonstrated a pattern of behavior that speaks to a profound moral failure. You took advantage of people's trust and compassion, profiting from their desire to help animals in need, then abandoned those same animals to suffer and die. This court sentences you to 5 years in territorial prison and orders you to pay restitution, covering all costs associated with the rescue and rehabilitation of the animals you abandoned. The courtroom erupted in applause, and Jack felt grim satisfaction. It was not enough, could never be enough to balance the scales of what Rossiter had done, but it was something. As they filed out of the courthouse, Sarah linked her arm through Jack's, the gesture casual but meaningful. "It's over," she said. "He can't hurt any more animals. The ones we saved are safe and heading to good homes. You did that, Jack. You started this by refusing to ride past suffering when you could have so easily looked away." "We did it," Jack corrected. "All of us together. I just happened to be the one who found them first." "Don't downplay what you did," Sarah said firmly. "Yes, the community came together, but you were the catalyst. You showed us what was possible when someone decides to care more about doing right than doing easy." She stopped walking and turned to face him, her expression serious. "I want you to know something. When I offered you the job in the cabin, it wasn't charity. I genuinely need help on the ranch, and you've already proven yourself to be exactly the kind of person I want working alongside me. Someone reliable, someone with integrity, someone who doesn't look away from hard truths." Jack felt heat rise in his face at the praise. He was not accustomed to being seen so positively, to having his actions valued and appreciated. "I'm not sure I deserve all that," he managed. "Then you'll just have to trust my judgment," Sarah replied with a smile that made something warm unfurl in Jack's chest. "Now, come on. We have horses to feed and a ranch to run. Welcome to your new life, Jack Morrison." The weeks that followed established a rhythm that Jack had never experienced before. He rose each morning in his cabin with Scout and Daisy stirring from their places by the fireplace. He would tend to Hope first, checking her progress and marveling at how quickly she was recovering. The paint mare had put on weight, her coat had regained its shine, and the hopelessness in her eyes had been replaced by genuine contentment. She nickered whenever she saw him, and Jack had taken to bringing her small treats, carrots or apples, that made her nose his pockets in search of more. Work on Sarah's ranch was demanding but satisfying in ways Jack had not anticipated. Unlike the temporary jobs he had taken over the years, this work had continuity and purpose. He was not just completing tasks and moving on. He was building something, maintaining something, being part of an operation that required consistency and commitment. Sarah proved to be an excellent teacher, showing him her methods for training horses, explaining her philosophy of animal care, trusting him with increasing responsibility as she saw his competence and dedication. They worked side by side most days, and Jack found himself looking forward to their conversations. Sarah had a way of drawing him out, asking questions that made him think about himself and his choices without feeling interrogated. She told him about her own life, about growing up on the ranch, about her mother's illness and death, about the challenges of running an operation largely on her own. There was no self-pity in these revelations, just honest acknowledgement of difficulty overcome and grief carried with dignity. Michael Cartwright was a frequent visitor to the ranch, ostensibly to check on supplies and ensure Sarah had everything she needed from the feed store. But Jack could see the way Michael looked at Sarah, the way his whole demeanor softened when she was near. He could also see that Sarah seemed genuinely fond of Michael, though whether that fondness extended to romantic feelings was harder to determine. Jack found himself hoping it did. Sarah deserved happiness, deserved someone who would appreciate her strength and support her dreams. The thought made him examine his own growing feelings for Sarah, feelings that went beyond simple gratitude or respect. He admired her competence and her compassion, the way she treated both animals and people with equal consideration. He appreciated her directness and her humor, the way she could be serious about important matters, but find joy in small moments. And he was attracted to her, though that attraction felt different from anything he had experienced before. It was not just physical, though she was undeniably beautiful in her practical, unadorned way. It was deeper than that, rooted in genuine connection and shared values. But Michael clearly had prior claim to Sarah's attention, and Jack had no intention of interfering in a relationship that existed before his arrival. Besides, he was still learning how to be a person who stayed, who participated in community, who allowed himself to care and be cared for. Adding romantic complications to that learning process seemed unwise at best and disastrous at worst. So he kept his feelings to himself and focused on the work, on the animals, on building the life he was still getting accustomed to having. One evening, about 6 weeks after the rescue, Sarah invited Jack to dinner at the main house. Tom was there as well, along with Michael, and the meal was relaxed and pleasant, filled with easy conversation and good food. After dinner, they sat on the porch watching the sunset paint the desert in impossible colors, and Tom raised the subject that Jack had been both anticipating and dreading. "Jack, you've been here over a month now, and you've proven yourself a dozen times over. The question I need to ask is whether you're planning to stay permanently, or if this is just a longer stop on your usual drifting path." Tom's voice was gentle but firm. "I'm not trying to pressure you, but Sarah needs to know if she can count on you long-term, or if she should be thinking about hiring someone else." Jack looked out at the desert, gathering his thoughts. In the paddock, Hope stood peacefully, her rehabilitation nearly complete. Scout and Daisy were curled up at his feet, trusting him to be there when they woke. The cabin that had become his home sat just across the yard, its windows glowing with the lamp he had left burning. Everything he could see represented connections he had formed, responsibilities he had accepted, a life he had built from nothing in just 6 weeks. "I'm staying," he said, surprised by how certain he sounded. "I mean, if you'll have me, if you'll have... I know I've got a history of moving on, and I can't promise I'll never feel the urge to drift again, but what I've found here, what you've all given me, it's worth staying for. It's worth being someone different than I've been." He looked at Sarah directly. You took a chance on me when you had no reason to trust that I'd stay. I want to prove that trust was justified." Sarah's smile was radiant, transforming her face with obvious relief and something that looked like genuine happiness. "I'm glad to hear it. You've become essential to this operation, Jack. More than that, you've become part of this family, small as it is." She glanced at her father, who nodded agreement, then at Michael, whose expression was harder to read. "There's something I need to say." Michael spoke up, his voice careful. "I've been coming around this ranch for 2 years now, and everyone, including me, assumed I had romantic intentions toward Sarah." He paused, looking uncomfortable but determined. "The truth is, Sarah's like a sister to me. I love her dearly, but not in that way. We've actually talked about this several times, trying to figure out how to make it clear to everyone without making a big announcement that would embarrass us both." Sarah was laughing now, shaking her head with affectionate exasperation. "We've been the subject of town gossip for years, haven't we? People seeing what they expected to see rather than what was actually there." "Guilty," Michael admitted with a rueful smile. "I kept visiting because Sarah's genuinely my closest friend and I care about her well-being. But romance? Never. Not for either of us." He looked at Jack with an expression that suggested he understood more about Jack's feelings than Jack had realized he was showing. "I'm telling you this because I don't want assumptions about my relationship with Sarah to prevent anyone from pursuing what might actually make her happy." The words hung in the air, loaded with implication. Jack felt his heart hammering against his ribs, felt everyone's eyes on him, felt the weight of a possibility he had not allowed himself to seriously consider. Sarah was watching him with an expression that held both vulnerability and hope, and Jack realized with stunning clarity that she had feelings for him too. That perhaps those feelings had been growing alongside his own, carefully hidden behind professional courtesy and friendly warmth. "I should probably get back to the cabin," Jack said, standing abruptly. "It's been a long day and I've got early chores tomorrow." He made his escape before anyone could respond, Scout and Daisy following at his heels. Behind him he heard Tom say something in a low voice and Michael's responding laugh, but he did not stop to hear what was said. His mind was reeling, his carefully constructed emotional walls crumbling faster than he could rebuild them. Sarah cared for him. She had offered him not just a job and a home, but potentially something more, something he had not allowed himself to want in over 20 years. In his cabin, Jack paced restlessly while Scout and Daisy watched with concerned expressions. What was he supposed to do with this information? He was a 42-year-old drifter who had spent most of his adult life alone, convinced that solitude was safer than connection. He had no experience with building lasting relationships, no track record of staying when things got difficult. What could he possibly offer someone like Sarah, who deserved someone stable and sure, someone who knew how to be a partner? But even as these doubts circled through his mind, another voice spoke up, quieter but insistent. He was not the same man who had ridden past the Silverton mine 6 weeks ago. That man would have kept riding, would have avoided entanglement, would have protected himself by remaining untouchable. This Jack, the one who had rescued abandoned animals and accepted help from strangers and built a home in a place he had never intended to stay, this Jack was capable of more than he had given himself credit for. Jack found Sarah in the barn the next morning, mucking out stalls with methodical efficiency. She looked up when he entered, and something in her expression suggested she had been expecting him. He stood there for a moment, hat in hand, trying to find words adequate to what he needed to say. In the end, he settled for simple truth. "I ran away last night," he said. "When Michael made it clear that he and you weren't romantically involved, when the implication was that maybe you and I could be, I ran, and I'm sorry for that." Sarah leaned on her pitchfork, regarding him with that penetrating gaze that always seemed to see more than he wanted to reveal. You were scared. That's understandable. I've been scared of a lot of things for a long time, Jack admitted, stepping further into the barn. Scared of staying anywhere long enough to care, scared of letting people depend on me, scared of being the kind of man who could fail at something important. He paused, then continued with difficulty. My father died when I was 18. Heart attack while working in the fields. My mother followed him less than a year later, just gave up without him. I had 2 younger sisters who needed me, and I ran. Told myself they'd be better off with our aunt and uncle than with me trying to keep the farm going when I didn't know what I was doing. Sarah's expression softened with understanding. Oh, Jack, I've been running ever since, he continued, the words coming faster now that he had started. Convincing myself I was free when really I was just afraid. Then I found those animals at the mine, and they didn't give me the option of running. They needed help immediately, and I had to make a choice, stay and try to save them, or ride away and live with knowing I'd left them to die. He looked at her directly. I chose to stay, and in staying I discovered something I'd forgotten. That being needed isn't a burden. That caring about others doesn't make you weak. That home isn't a trap, it's a gift. And what about me? Sarah asked quietly. What did you discover about me? Jack took a deep breath, feeling like he was standing on the edge of something vast and terrifying and wonderful. I discovered that you're the bravest person I've ever met. That you've taken your own grief and turned it into compassion for others. That you see the best in people and animals even when they can't see it in themselves. He moved closer, his heart hammering. And I discovered that somewhere along the way I fell in love with you. Not the dramatic, sweep you off your feet kind of love, but the steady, build a life together kind. The kind that scares me more than anything because it requires me to be someone I've never been before. Tears shimmered in Sarah's eyes, but she was smiling. And who is that? Someone who stays, Jack said simply. Someone who keeps promises. Someone worthy of being loved in return. Sarah set down her pitchfork and closed the distance between them, reaching up to touch his face with gentle fingers. Jack Morrison, you've been worthy all along. You just needed to believe it yourself. She leaned forward and kissed him, soft and sweet and full of promise. When they pulled apart, she was definitely crying now, but her smile was radiant. I love you too. I think I have since you came crawling out of that mine covered in dust with puppies in your arms, risking your life for creatures nobody else wanted. They wanted to be saved, Jack said, pulling her close. Just like I did, even though I didn't know it. The sound of applause made them both turn. Tom stood in the barn doorway, grinning widely. About damn time. I was starting to worry you two would dance around each other for years. He moved into the barn, his expression turning serious. Jack, I want you to know that Sarah's happiness is the most important thing in the world to me. If you hurt her, we're going to have problems. If I hurt her, I'll deserve whatever you want to do to me, Jack replied honestly. But I'm going to spend every day trying to be the man she deserves. That's all any of us can do, Tom said, his voice rough with emotion. He pulled Jack into a quick, hard hug, then stepped back with suspiciously bright eyes. Welcome to the family, son. 3 months later, Jack stood in the same spot where he had first discovered the abandoned animals, looking at the old Silverton mine with very different eyes. The town had voted to turn the site into a memorial and sanctuary for rescued animals. Sarah's ranch had become the official adoption and rehabilitation center, with Jack serving as manager of the program. Hope grazed peacefully nearby, fully recovered and gleaming in the afternoon sun. Scout and Daisy explored the area with enthusiastic curiosity, grown confident and healthy. The other animals from the rescue had all been placed in carefully vetted homes, except for 3 older horses who would live out their days on Sarah's ranch, too elderly to be adopted but deserving of comfort and care. Are you ready? Sarah asked, coming to stand beside him. She wore a simple blue dress that brought out her eyes, and her hair was loose around her shoulders for once. In her hands, she carried wildflowers that Jack had picked that morning. "I am," he said, taking her hand in his. They walked together to where Reverend Matthews waited, along with Tom, Michael, Dr. Hayes, Martha Wilson, Billy Chen, and dozens of others from Copper Springs who had become more than neighbors. They had become family. The ceremony was simple and heartfelt, conducted in the place where Jack's life had changed forever. When Reverend Matthews pronounced them husband and wife, and Jack kissed Sarah under the vast desert sky, he felt the last of his old loneliness finally release its hold. That evening, as the celebration continued and the sun painted the desert gold and purple, Jack found himself alone for a moment near Hope's paddock. The paint mare came to the fence, and he scratched behind her ears the way she liked. "Thank you," he told her quietly. "If I hadn't found you, if you hadn't survived long enough for me to reach you, I don't know where I'd be right now. Probably still drifting, still alone, still convinced that was the only way to live." Hope nickered softly and bumped his chest with her nose, and Jack smiled. He had come to the old Silverton mine as a lonely cowboy, with nothing but his horse and his solitude. He had found abandoned animals dying in the desert, their suffering a mirror of his own hidden pain. In saving them, he had discovered his own capacity for love, for connection, for staying when staying mattered most. The mine had held heartbreak and cruelty and suffering, but it had also held the seeds of transformation. Sometimes, Jack reflected, the most beautiful things grew from the darkest places. Sometimes finding others who needed saving was the first step to saving yourself. Sarah appeared at his side, sliding her arm around his waist. "What are you thinking about?" "About how a man can spend 20 years running from home only to discover it was waiting for him all along in a place he never expected to find it." He pulled her close, breathing in the scent of wildflowers in her hair. "About how the worst day of those animals' lives led to the best day of mine." "It led to the best day of mine too," Sarah said, reaching up to kiss him again. In the paddock, Hope whinnied softly as if offering her blessing. Scout and Daisy curled up at their feet, content and secure in the knowledge that their people were exactly where they belonged. The desert wind whispered through the sage, carrying with it the promise of seasons to come, of challenges and joys and ordinary miracles that would fill the years ahead. Jack Morrison had finally stopped running. He had found what he had been searching for all along, in the last place he ever thought to look. In the eyes of abandoned animals who taught him that being saved and saving others were sometimes the same thing. In the heart of a woman who saw his worth before he could see it himself. In a community that welcomed him home before he even knew he was looking for one. The lonely cowboy had found his place at last, and it was more beautiful than anything he could have imagined.